What's up, y'all? Sorry for the late start today. How y'all doing? Got another little, only a minute or two before we get fully started. Just trying to figure out something here real quick before we get fully started. I'm not expecting many people to jump in today, simply because it's not a normal day that we do podcast stuff. But it might be in the near future because, well, doing it on Thursdays is proving to be a little more difficult because I am now participating in more stuff IRL through politics and things. But we are still doing debates. Let me go ahead and turn this down a little bit more because that's a little too loud. You can have the music in the background while we do this. So yeah, we're doing things. We're doing some good things here on the cast. So I have a pretty big announcement to make. It appears that this is actually going to happen. Let me double check my email though, make sure that hasn't been rescinded. You're a little late on getting the emails, but I have been invited. I've been invited to Modern Day Debate Con in Dallas on November 5th, and I will be one of the people participating in the live Modern Day Debates debate. Topic to be kind of determined, but it will revolve around criminal justice and criminal justice reform and policing and the like. Should be good. I've attended Modern Day Debate Con as a viewer at least once. It might have been twice. I think it was twice, actually. Yeah, it was twice. And it was a good time. But the way these things kind of go, it looks like I'll be in front of a live audience as well as streaming there on the 5th to debate criminal justice and policing with a pretty well-known conservative on that topic. Because I haven't gotten a full response yet about it, I was invited to, and I didn't get the response to say, hey, I accept. Not going to say who it is I'm going to be debating yet, or the exact topic, because that's not fully determined. Who I'm debating is determined, assuming that this still goes through. I'm pretty sure it's still going to go through, but yes. So November 5th, mark your calendars. If you are in the Dallas area, you should come by, because I'll be there in person. So yeah, should be good. Should be good. Gonna schmooze with some of the other people in the scene. It should be a good time. We are also doing other debates on the cast. We did one this past Wednesday on sports and culture, which was a good little show with Lee the Water Kai. And I will get that link to you all here in a second. It was done live, and we talked about a couple of different things. Oops, sorry about that. Didn't mean for that to come through. But here's the link to that. Highly recommend watching that. It was a good debate. It was a good discussion, rather. Not many people disagreed on the topic per se. It was still a good discussion. Yeah. But let's go ahead and get into it. Go ahead and get into the newscast proper. Oops. Not the right thing. Wait, yes it is. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Crowdsourced Politics News Roundup. I am your host and moderator of the Crowdsourced Politics podcast, Cypher, and today we have a lot of news that we're going to cover, so we're going to go ahead and get right into it. Starting up first, as usual, with news and updates about Ukraine. So Ukraine's counteroffensive is now showing inroads against Russia's war of aggression, according to reporting from The Guardian and the BBC. Ukrainian forces have decisively breached Russia's first defense line near Zaporizhzhia after weeks of painstaking mine clearance. New, faster gains are expected as they press the weaker second line, according to the general leading the southern counteroffensive. It's estimated that Russia had devoted approximately 60% of its time and resources into building the first defensive line, and only about 20% each into the second and third lines, because Moscow had not expected Ukrainian forces to get through that first line of defense. And why would they? They heavily mined the area, and that would have slowed them down immensely had they not gotten equipment from the United States and other Western allies. Now, Ukrainian forces are now between the first and second line of defense there. So they've gotten through the first line, they're in the second, they're in that area where there's going to be fighting and stuff, and they're going to approach the second line of defense. That's where we are with Ukraine. The UK's Minister of Defense has said Russia's President Putin is flooding the front lines with poorly trained troops, noting that, quote, the reluctance of some elements to fight in the war. It is in its daily intelligence briefing, the government highlighted that Russia is convicting nearly 100 soldiers a week for refusing to fight, adding there will be around 5,200 convictions just this year. Quote, the high rate of convictions demonstrates the poor state of morale in the Russian army and the reluctance of some elements to fight, the Ministry of Defense from the UK had added. Continuing on, they stated, quote, although some soldiers have refused to fight and attrition rates remain high, Russia's highly likely... let's start that over. Continuing on, quote, although some soldiers have refused to fight and attrition rates remain high, Russia highly likely mitigates their losses by committing a mass of poorly trained soldiers to the front lines. The Ministry of Defense update comes on the same day Moscow accused Ukraine of launching the biggest drone attack on its soil since the war began. At least 4 Russian military transport planes were destroyed in the drone attack at the Pskov airport in western Russia, the regional government had said, as flights operations to and from the airport were suspended. Ukrainian forces were, quote, on the move, President Zelensky said, as the U.S. acknowledged that the notable progress of the counteroffensive over the past few days. Zelensky said on Telegram, quote, despite everything and no matter what anyone says, we are advancing, and that is the most important thing. Russia now risks dividing its forces it seeks to prevent the Ukrainian breakthrough in Ukraine's south, also according to the UK's Ministry of Defense. It said Ukrainian forces continue to take offensive action on the Kharkiv axis in southern Ukraine, with units reaching the first Russian main defensive line. Ukraine's drone war on Russia is now almost a daily occurrence as well. Wednesday's attack at Pskov, Banitsky, and elsewhere were among the most widespread of drone strikes so far. A fuel depot in Kaluga, and a microelectronics factory in Bryansk, where components for Russia's weapons systems are made, were also hit in those attacks. On Thursday morning, the mayor of Moscow said another drone had been shot down southeast of Moscow. Earlier, Russian media reported drones of flights had been delayed getting tongue-tied here, my bad. Earlier, Russian media reported that dozens of flights had been delayed at Moscow's airport, a regular occurrence during drone attacks. President Volodymyr Zelensky said the Ukrainian-made weapon had hit a target at a distance of 700 kilometers. He did not specify the weapon or the target, but the distance could correspond to the Pskov attack. Russian officials say 4 long-range cargo planes were damaged. The planes are ideal for transporting troops and equipment over long distances. The planes are considered valuable war assets for Russia. Russia has vowed that Ukraine will not go unpunished for these attacks. In previous retaliation attacks for those drones, the Ukrainian defense initiatives, air defense, and the like, have been able to intercept the majority of rockets, missiles, and drones that the Russian government has sent towards them, especially the further west it goes. So I don't expect much of the retaliation to actually have like a punch through on it, but it is possible that they will raise the stakes and this will continue on the fighting. But continuing on, the British defense company the British defense company BAE Systems is setting up a local entity in Ukraine and has signed deals with its government to help ramp up its supply of weapons and equipment. BAE said it would work directly with Kyiv to explore potential partners for a plan to ultimately produce 105mm light artillery guns in Ukraine and to better understand Ukrainians' defense requirements. As the UK's biggest defense contractor, BAE has manufactured much of the equipment that British and other governments have provided to Ukraine as it fends off the Russian invasion. Britain is a key defense supplier for Ukraine, and it may become the first country to start supplying Kyiv with long-range cruise missiles. Quote, the best weapons that are currently helping our warriors defend Ukraine should be produced in Ukraine, President Zelensky tweeted after a meeting with the BAE chief executive, Charles Woodburn. Continuing on, he stated, quote, the development of our own weapons production is a top priority. And this makes a ton of sense. If you're relying on other governments to bring in weapons into your country while you're actively fighting a war, that delays your ability to replenish your front lines with needed equipment and munitions, which slows everything down and makes it possible for Russia to exploit that. If you're developing the weapons within the country or, just on the border of the country, whatever the case may be, that decreases the time for delivery of said weapons, which increases their effectiveness. It should be noted here that Ukraine is going to be paying for some of these, but they're also going to use some of the money that the United States and other countries have given them directly for those weapons, either in the form of direct financial assistance, giving them cash directly, or loan guarantees, which basically reduce the amount of cost, the cost for borrowing money in order to get these weapons. The majority of the money that the United States has provided to Ukraine has come in the form of weapons, ammunition, equipment, etc. So all the stuff that is used to fight a war, and loan guarantees, not physical dollars. So when you see the United States sending another $450 billion to Ukraine, they're not literally writing a check for $450 billion. They're not literally telling the Fed to print more money and just handing over the cash to Ukraine. It's not the way this works. The government uses accrual counting, which means that anything that the government gives to Ukraine is considered cash as far as accounting purposes goes. So for every $1,000 of bullets they give, that's booked as $1,000 to Ukraine. And that's why we have these giant numbers. And people are like, well, why can't we give money to you? Well, it's not money. That's why. So if you are upset that Ukraine is getting money, please know that this is mostly in-kind donations, aid to Ukraine, and not direct cash assistance. Should be noted there as well. Also, this helps actually produce jobs within the United States and elsewhere with the loan guarantees, because if you guarantee a loan to the Ukrainians for, we'll say, like $300 million, well, they have to use those dollars to buy, generally speaking, US-made equipment, because that's what the loan guarantees for. So it's just kind of this weird looping away where the Ukrainians are going to have to pay this loan back eventually, and they're being given money from a private bank, in order to get that. Again, it is accrual accounting, should be noted. Let's continue on though. So Ukraine has signed a statement of intent with Sweden as well to strengthen cooperation in the production and operations of the CV-90 family of armored vehicles made by a Swedish unit of BAE. Western defense companies have been weighing opportunities to make weapons in Ukraine against the possible security risk. In other news, elections are underway in Russian-controlled provinces of Ukraine as part of a move to cement Moscow's authorities in its quote-unquote new territories, despite the ongoing conflict. Russia does not fully control any of the 4 regions where the votes are being held: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. So that means that they're going to, these more or less sham elections. Eastern Ukraine doesn't necessarily want to be fully integrated into Ukraine proper anymore for a variety of different reasons, but these elections should not be taken as a surefire sign that they want to be 100% within the Russian Federation, given the conflict, given the fact that Russia controls them, given the fact that Russia has made bullshit things like this in the past with other countries and territory it's taken, where they just stuffed ballot boxes and the like, made a big show of how everybody is voting and they're doing all this stuff, but then the vote comes in and it's like 92% in favor of doing whatever Russia wanted. It's nonsense. So I wouldn't take those votes. I take those votes with a grain of salt. And finally in our news in Ukraine, the Nobel Foundation has reversed its decision to invite ambassadors from Russia and Belarus to this year's Nobel Award ceremony in Stockholm. The move has sparked anger in Sweden and abroad, per reporting from The Guardian. The foundation said on Saturday it had chosen to, quote, repeat last year's exception to regular practice, that is, to not invite ambassadors of Russia, Belarus, and Iran. And this apparently was at the behest of the King of Sweden. It's a ceremonial rule, but King of Sweden says don't invite Russia to Nobel. Let's make sure of this. Pretty sure it was the king that said that. It was like somebody really high up in the Nobel committee was like, hey, why are we inviting this first? Yeah. So Saturday's announcement was widely praised in Sweden by politicians. Even the Swiss royal house reacted with spokesman Margaret Thorgan saying, as quoted by the newspaper Aftonbladet, that, quote, we see the change in the decision as positive. She added that King Carl XVI Gustav was planning to hand out this year's Nobel Awards at ceremonies in Stockholm as before. So yeah, the King Gustav is basically like, hey, yo, why is Russia showing up to this thing? We're not doing, like, they're bad, so let's not invite them. And, you know, being as it is still kind of like this old royalist kind of thing, they're like, no, we're not going to invite them. You're right, Gustav. We don't want to lose you. So Russia, Iran, and Belarus can go fuck themselves. But that, my friends, concludes this segment of the News Roundup. So if you're just joining us, welcome. This is the Crowdsourced Politics News Roundup. We do this typically on Thursdays, starting around 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we go for about 2 hours. We're doing it today because this past week I attended a event here in Austin that where local journalists for the Texas Tribune just talked about all the laws impacting Texas, and it was a good time. I got to talk to some really cool people, some really good journalists there over at the Texas Tribune, share some of the insights that I know, get some of the insights that they have, and it was a good conversation. It was a good time for us political nerds over here. So again, that's why we weren't doing it there. This program might move to Sundays. I really don't want to move it to Sunday, but there seems to be more stuff happening on Thursdays in the near future, so it might have to move to Sundays. The whole reason we were doing this on Thursday is because I wanted to beat the Friday News Roundup from NPR, all the new national Sunday shows, all those people. I wanted to beat them to the punch. I wanted to get it done on Thursday, so that we would, if we produced a clip or something from it, or if people tuned in, they'd be like, hey, I heard about that first with Crowdsourced. But that's not going to be a thing, and it hasn't really caught on. So we might move it to Sundays and do, like, you know, just a really long Sunday stream, 5-6 hours or something. Who knows? We'll get into it. But again, typically Thursdays, typically 2 hours. We're also doing other stuff. So I will be, if you weren't here at the top of the show, I will be going to Modern Day Debate Con 4 in Dallas, Texas on November 5th. And I will be participating in that as a debater. I will be debating some issue surrounding criminal justice, police reform, what have you, right? It'll be something along those lines. The exact topic has not been determined, but I have been invited and I know who I'm debating. Until that topic is settled, I will not announce who I'm debating because, anything can happen between now and November. I don't want to get people's hopes up. But I have the email, I have the receipts, so this should be a good time. I've been invited to be an actual participant, so that's good news for us over here at CSP. I've participated in Modern Day Debate Con before, but only as a participant and asking questions. So if you go to MDD and you see some of the old cons, you can probably hear me asking questions and getting blown off or have them answered by people like Ben Burgess, Xander Hall, Actual Justice Warrior, Nuance Bro, Destiny, Dylan Burns, etc. So it's, generally speaking, it's a pretty good time. Generally speaking, it's a lot of bigger to middle name people there participating in the conference. So looking forward to that. If you're in the Dallas area on November 4th or 5th, maybe even the 3rd to the 5th or so, let me know. I'm willing to meet up and we can have a beer or something. So go ahead and do that as well. We're doing other debates on the program. Again, last week, this past Wednesday, we did this debate, which was on culture and politics and sports, and it was a good time. So if you want to see me on there, hey, just hit me up. And we're also looking for a video editor. If you or someone you know knows how to edit talking head videos such as this, I'm guaranteeing you at least 8 hours of work a month. And I will pay decent money for those 8 hours of work a month. And I estimate it as 8 hours because, I know that from my own personal experience editing videos and segments and getting things clipped in and adjusting them just right and stuff, that if there's about an hour to 2 hours worth of content that needs to be edited, that's anywhere between 4 and 6 hours of work. So I'm guaranteeing that, and I'm able to pay you monthly on this. It's another way we decide how to do it. Or, if at one point the channel ends up making money, doing a massive revenue split between you and myself for the content that's being edited. I know that people like Shark say that they give their editors 100% of whatever's produced of those channels. Not sure if I would do it 100%, but for now, I'm definitely willing to pay you directly for that work. So if you knew somebody that needs a bit of editing work or has the ability to do so and could use some extra money and has the time in order to do, anywhere between 4 and 8 hours worth of work a week, 4 to 8 hours worth of work a month for decent pay for that time spent, let me know. Send them my way. So that's what we're doing. But let's go ahead and continue on now with the cast. And now we're going to talk about U.S. politics, starting with the U.S. Congress and getting into some other things in the 2024 election cycle. So the House is set to return from summer break on September 12th. As we've covered extensively on the Roundup, the top of the agenda will be funding the government. The Republican-controlled House, bending to the will of a smaller group of hardline conservatives, is pushing to cut discretionary spending to a fiscal 2022 level of $1.47 trillion. This would be $120 billion less than top House Republican Kevin McCarthy and Democratic President Joe Biden agreed to earlier this year. It's clear that Congress will have to pass a continuing resolution by September 30th in order to prevent a partial government shutdown. Both House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican of California, and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, a New York Democrat, have agreed in principle to pass the necessary continuing resolutions. But it is expected to be a bitter fight in the House, especially with how much of the Republican conference is against this deal. And since the Republican conference has such a narrow majority support, a dozen so House members could derail it if Kevin McCarthy doesn't make deals with Democrats on that issue. Now, for the Senate's part, the Senate will return from its break on September 5th. The focus in the Senate upon its return won't be on passing appropriation bills, because that body took care of that business before they recessed last month. Majority Leader Schumer said Friday that the House Republicans would be to blame if lawmakers are unable to reach a deal to keep the government funded past September 30th. If a deal cannot be reached, it would trigger the fourth partial shutdown of federal agencies in a decade. Quote, "We cannot afford the brinkmanship of hostage-taking we saw from House Republicans earlier this year when they pushed our country to the brink of default to appease the most extreme members of their party," Schumer said in an open letter to colleagues on Friday. Continuing on, quote, "When the Senate returns next week, our focus will be on funding the government and preventing House Republican extremists from forcing a government shutdown." That ends this segment. Actually, let's talk about this for a bit. Let's pontificate on this just a little bit before we end the segment. Why is this happening? Well, as I've said on this program numerous times, the reason that this is happening is because a large contingent of Republicans do not believe that government should do much of anything. And from an ideological perspective, when the government shuts down, that is an ideological win for that large contingent of Republicans and conservatives. They don't believe in governing. They believe in the free market handling everything, or the less government, the better. Or if the deep state doesn't exist, then everything will be fine for you and me. The IRS can't come for your taxes. The EPA can't tell us what we can drill and can't drill. And the FDA and the agricultural sector can't tell us we can't have cookies and high fructose corn syrup and whatever else is on their agenda. The government, the military, we don't fund the government. The military can't impose its woke ideology on our men and women in the armed forces. You know, typical nonsense stuff. And so if it doesn't happen, if that stuff doesn't happen, that's a win for them. And it's kind of nonsense. Another reason, well, it's not kind of nonsense, it is nonsense. But another reason why this happens is because the government doesn't actually shut down, really, when there's a government shutdown. There's two reasons for that. First, there are mandatory reporting for duty within the government. All law enforcement agents have to show up to work. All military has to show up to work. Social Security checks still go out because that is mandatory. Medicare and Medicaid payments still go out because that is mandatory. So the things that would impact people the most are essentially exempt from shutting down. Now, this doesn't mean that the people doing those jobs will be paid, though. So they will be forced to work without pay. When the government shut down in the past, banks and loan companies and stuff basically got together and be like, okay, we know we're going to get our money eventually from the government, right? We know that you're going to receive your check from the government in maybe 3 weeks, maybe a month tops, right? So they still paid them. When the government shut down, I want to say, was it 2013? Government shut down. I'm looking it up real quick. Yeah, 2013. I was right. So when the government shut down in 2013, it happened right before I was supposed to be paid because I was in the military at the time. And when that happened, I still was paid because I banked with USAA. And USAA, as a bank, agreed to make us whole and provide us with our checks because they felt that the government would be paying eventually. And so they would just take that back once the government paid them. Maybe the government had to pay them interest on that and they made some money off of it. I don't know the particulars of that per se. I don't know the particulars of that. But at the same time, I was still paid. So I didn't really care, right? I mean, I cared because I'm, engaged in politics, but it didn't really impact me. So that's the other reason why government shutdowns aren't that big of a deal to conservatives. One of the things that it does do, though, it does put things into disarray. Another thing that Republicans are basically okay with. Because again, if the government's not functioning, that just proves that the government shouldn't do a thing, so the government shouldn't have the power to do it. So all these things combined come together to give basically the opposite of a good incentive to Republicans to keep the government funded. Now, during an election year, though, which is what we're entering, that plays a bit differently. Because if you suddenly can't go to like the Smithsonian during field trips for school or your family vacation in the fall, or you can't go to a national park during the end of the season to see nature, if you can't go to your local Social Security office to get some of the things that you need, a death in the family happens, what have you, that's going to look bad. The media is going to focus on this. And it's going to lay the blame at the feet of Republicans because it is their fault. Make no mistake, this is the fault of Republicans. Republicans, if the government shuts down and it can't do a continuing resolution until they can agree on a budget, if they can't agree on a budget, it's going to be the Republicans' fault because they're the ones with the more extreme position on this. Right? If they come over the top and be like, okay, we want to cut discretionary spending by 30%, and that's all going to come from quote unquote welfare. Welfare is already cut to the bone. There's not much else you can get from there. It doesn't make sense, right? So it's going to play in the media the way that it should play, which is that the Republicans are not being genuine or not being reasonable. Republicans are not being reasonable. And they'll get the blame as they should. This isn't to say that I hope the government shuts down. I don't want the government to shut down. I want the government to keep going. I am not anti-government. So when the government does something that is stupid, it impacts everybody negatively, right? It impacts trust in it. It impacts a slew of different things. So we don't want that to happen. But if it does happen, political points are likely to go to Democrats. Remember that. But with that, my friends, that does conclude this segment of the Roundup. Oh, well, let's actually have a little bit more to cover here. So, sorry about that. Okay, never mind. Okay. All right, let's continue on now with the newscast, though. And let's go move into the 2024 election cycle with some congressional race check-ins. And, of course, we have to talk about the thing that everybody saw these last few days, these last couple of weeks. We're talking about how old is too old to remain in Congress. For the second time in less than 2 months, Kentucky Republican Senator Mitch McConnell had to be escorted away from microphones in the middle of a press conference, based on reporting from USA Today. The 81-year-old Republican leaders froze while speaking with a gaggle of reporters, raising more concerns about McConnell's health and ability to serve. The latest report prompted Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley to say, quote, "The Senate is the most privileged nursing home in the country. I mean, Mitch McConnell has done some great things. He deserves credit, but you have to know when to leave." McConnell, who turned 81 in February, is the longest serving party leader in the Senate history. His 7th term in office is set to end in January of 2027. Reporting from KEGT Bakersfield related that it's not just McConnell whose health and age are at the center of a conversation. California Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein, who is 90 years old, has struggled with her health over at least the past year. She spent nearly 3 months away from Congress after she was hospitalized with shingles in March. And her health and mental capacity have long been questioned. Feinstein has said she will retire next year. And then came out and said, "Oh, did I say that? That makes sense, I guess. They did this to me." It's really ridiculous. It really is. And on top of all that, the current U.S. Senate is the oldest in U.S. history. Now, does this mean that we should pull up term limits? Not necessarily, but it does seem that that is what the majority of voters want. And according to reporting from The Guardian, an overwhelming majority of Americans on both sides of the political aisle want term limits for members of Congress. That's the takeaway from a University of Maryland poll earlier this year that found that 83% of voters support amending the Constitution to establish term limits, including 86% of Republicans and 80% of Democrats. The survey also measured which arguments, both for and against the change, voters found persuasive. Quote, "I would say the most significant factor here is the perception that Congress is not responsive to the people, that Congress has become too comfortable, too safe," said Stephen Cole, a political psychologist and director of the program and public consultation at the University of Maryland. Feinstein's frailty and McConnell's obvious health issues have reignited a long-standing debate. Should there be a cap on the amount of time legislators can serve? Such a change would require a constitutional amendment, which needs support from 2/3 of Congress and hasn't happened since 1992. Lawmakers tried to impose federal term limits back in 1995, but the proposal failed in the House, coming up 61 votes short. The amendment would have limited members of Congress to 12 years in either chamber. That's just two term limits in the Senate, 6 in the House. That's not okay. I don't agree with this, and I'll get into why later. So the current Congress is the 3rd oldest since 1789, and there's been a renewed push to impose term limits over the past year. In January, Republican Representative Ralph Northam of South Carolina introduced a proposal limiting representatives to 3 terms and senators to 2 terms. As part of his negotiations to win the gavel, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy reportedly promised to bring up term limit proposals to the House floor for a vote. So far, that hasn't happened, though. As of June, 112 House members and 21 senators have signed pledges backing an amendment limiting House representatives to 3 terms and senators to 2 terms. Those numbers are well below 2/3 majority that is needed. Norman's proposal would impose an age limit, which is something nearly 60% of Americans want, according to a 2022 YouGov poll. Opponents of term limits have argued that they are anti-democratic and prevent policymakers from gaining important experience that makes them better at their job. Quote, term limits would impose a tremendous brain drain on the institution, Casey Burgett, director of the Legislative Affairs Master's Program at George Washington University, wrote in 2018. Continuing on, she stated, quote, fewer experienced policymakers in Congress results in increased influence of special interests that are ready and willing to fill in issue-specific Continuing on, Casey stated, quote, fewer experienced policymakers in Congress result in increased influence of special interests that are ready and willing to fill the issue-specific information voids. Instead, Burgert said elections are the best way to remove unresponsive and ineffectual members of Congress. Okay, we got to talk about this because I know that this is a issue that the majority of Americans support. They want term limits of some sort. They're not needed. From a theory standpoint, from a practicality standpoint, you don't need term limits. What you need is competitive elections. And you're not going to get competitive elections unless you fix all the other issues that plague our voting system. Redistricting, gerrymandering, first past the post voting, etc. All these issues are what is at the heart of the old age in Congress problem. Now, we can talk about whether or not there should be some sort of recall for a sitting member of Congress in a particular state. That's going to be a state issue. We can talk about whether or not there should be some age limit on it. An age limit might make sense. It's not going to... A person that is 90 years old, by and large, isn't probably going to be able to do the job of a sitting congressman or a president, right? Maybe we can talk about that. But these things are anti-democratic. They are against human rights. They are ageist, okay? We have to acknowledge these things. We have to acknowledge that this is a barrier to the exercise of someone's rights based on age and tenure. And if we don't acknowledge that, then we run afoul of the fact that this is something that could end up backfiring and being worse than what we currently have. So part of the reason why, what was it? It was the 17th Amendment? 17th Amendment for Senate popular vote. Yeah. All right. So it was the 17th Amendment. I know things. I don't have to look everything up. So part of the reason why we have the 17th Amendment, which took the power for voting for a person to go to Senate away from state legislatures and given them to the general population, is because party bosses ended up doing things that were anti-democratic. What we do when we remove term limits, or when we impose term limits onto sitting congressmen, legislatures, is that we make the issue of unelected bureaucrats, unelected staff, unelected party officials having more power to do what they want, vis-a-vis needing to have a structure in place that keeps institutional memory going, that keeps people engaged in the process, that keeps things in such a way where there is consistency between one cadre of people in Congress and the next. And all this will do, or not all it will do, but one of the things that it will do is that it will give party bosses more say in how we do things in Congress. Because if you're only going to be there for 2 years, or I'm sorry, we'll say between 2 and 12 years, right? 2 years, the lowest that a person in Congress can be in. They're all talking about imposing it. 6 in the House, 2 in the Senate, which is 12 years each. If you're only going to be there for 12 years, then in order for more people to come in and to have this kind of consistency from 1 year to the next, as well as of how things ought to be ran, how to get a party's policies in place, then you have to rely on people that are outside the elected body in order to continue on with that desire, with that policy. So if, for example, this is an easy one, right? The presidency has a term limit of 2 terms, right? 8 years, 10 if you serve half a term. Okay, so 8 years, 2 terms of office, 10 years maximum should you be vice president and the president dies, right? Some like to that extent. And what happens is that when a president is in office, they're in office for only 8 years tops, and the next president can come in and just, like, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, mind you, but they come in and change everything. Okay, that's what happened with Trump. Trump came in and changed everything. That's what people wanted. Okay, that's what people that voted for him want. I'm not saying this is a bad thing in and of itself, but it does make it to where there isn't consistency that other people around the world have in their governments. And that is also a bad thing. If you impose that onto Congress, you're going to have that as even a higher level, and you're going to have it in instances where the unelected bureaucrats, the people that Republicans and conservatives supposedly hate, have more power, because they're going to be the ones that are going to be like, hey, you want X, Y, or Z to happen. Well, the best way for that to happen is for A, B, and C to do it. We're the people that know this. We've been working on this for 20 years. You should listen to us. Rather than a person goes to Congress, they have some advice from their people, they have some advice from outside the people, they are beholden to the people of their district or their state, and then they can look at the things and have the actual ability, the power to be like, no, I don't think that's right. I think that what we should do is CDE or DEF. Okay, that's not going to happen as much with term limits. We can complain about the incumbent effect. The incumbent effect is as high as it is within Congress because none of the districts are competitive. So if you aren't wanting somebody in Congress to be there until they're a decrepit old person, until they're a lich, and they're fucking pulling the strings back with dark magical forces, then what you should be for is for more competitive races and the ability to recall people that are doing bad things and to hold them accountable. It is the best way, and it solves a number of different issues that we're about to get into. So with that, my friends, that concludes this segment, the News Roundup. But just to say, again, the reason why this is a thing is because the districts aren't competitive. More competitive districts means more turnover, but good turnover, people-driven turnover, not arbitrary limits. And that's where we're going to run that at. But let's now move on to additional information about this. And like I just said, one of the other issues that we have with the way that our current voting system is structured is that we have extreme partisan divides. So let's talk about it. So every president since Ulysses S. Grant has been either a Republican or a Democrat. Dominated by 2 major parties for over a century and a half, American politics has long been a breeding ground for partisanship. Some level of political polarization can be a feature of a healthy democracy. But the growing divide between the left and right in recent years has itself become one of the biggest problems facing the country. According to 24/7 Wall Street, Americans today are far more likely to have negative perceptions of those with differing political opinions than even a couple of years ago. One study conducted by Pew Research Center found that the share of Republicans who see Democrats as dishonest and immoral climbed from 45% to 72% and 47 to 27% respectively between 2016 and 2022. That means that 72% of Republicans right now consider Democrats to be immoral and dishonest. This is not just a Republican issue, though. Democrats have similar shares when they see Republicans as dishonest and immoral, going from 42% to 64% and from 35% to 63% over the same period. This is ridiculous. We are at a political brink with this amount of division that is in our country right now. We need to fix this. One of the things that I said earlier in the program is that if we had more competitive districts, that would help fix this. Because one, the stakes wouldn't be as high because there would be more. It would change where the Overton window is. You wouldn't have to be so extreme to the left or extreme to the right to win certain districts, because the only thing that matters is the primary. Ranked choice voting could help fix this as well, because then candidates who are more moderate could come up into the political arena. Other things, right? All these things need to be fixed, because if they're not fixed, it's going to cause more problems than even we have now. And that's some of the stuff that we have to talk about. Now, political gridlock in Washington is one symptom of America's partisan division, as lawmakers are less likely to seek compromise now that they have been in decades. Meaning okay, so let me say that again. Political gridlock in Washington is one symptom of America's partisan divide. As lawmakers are less likely to seek compromise now more than ever in recent decades. Another recent Pew study, which surveyed Americans of different party affiliations on 16 major issues facing the country, highlights just how far these political divisions go. Using data from a June 2023 Pew survey, 24/7 Wall Street identified the biggest issues in America with the largest partisan divide. The 16 issues on this list are ranked by the gap between Democrat and Republican-leaning voters who see them as a very big problem. So what are we talking about? Top 16. So we're going to go in reverse order. We're going to go from 16 to 12 to 1, etc. All right. So first up, unemployment. Likely Democratic voters see this as a big, big problem of 23% surveyed, the lowest of 16 issues tied. Likely Republican voters who see this issue as a very big problem is 23%. American adults who see the issue as a big problem is only 24%. 15. The ability of Democrats and Republicans to speak to one another or to work together. 14. Conditions of roads, bridges, and other infrastructures. I thought that would be higher, but maybe that's a local thing and there are people who are thinking about this as a national issue. 13 is the quality of public education K through 12. 12 is drug addiction. 11 is violent crime. 10 is international terrorism. 9 is domestic terrorism. 8 is healthcare affordability. 7 is inflation. 6 is the state of moral values. Getting up more into cultural stuff here. Number 6, cultural moral value. 5, the federal budget deficit. That's interesting. So the partisan divide on this issue is 33-point gap between Republicans and Democrats. Likely Democratic voters who see this issue as a top concern is 39%. However, Republicans view this 72%. 72% think that this is a huge issue. So that gap is pretty big between Democrats and Republicans. Racism is another huge gap. 41% of the gap between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats see this as a very big problem with 55%, whereas only 14% of Republicans view it as an issue. Gun violence, another huge partisan divide. Again, Democrats overwhelmingly think that gun violence is a huge issue, with 81% of Democrats saying that this is a big issue, whereas only 38% of Republicans say that it is a big issue. And even among those people who say this is a big issue on the Republican side, their likelihood of agreeing with Democratic solutions or Democrat solutions to this problem is pretty small. Illegal immigration. This is another huge gap. More cultural stuff for the most part. A little bit of nationalism on this part, all right? 25% of Democrats see this as a big issue. 70% of Republicans see this as a big issue. And with the 25% of Democrats who see this as a big issue, the likelihood of them agreeing on the solutions with the 70% of Republicans that see it as a big issue is fairly slim as well. And finally, the number one issue, the number one divide is climate change. Of course, 50-point gap between Democrats and Republicans. 64% of Democrats view this as a big issue, while only 14% of Republicans do. Isn't that ridiculous? Let's go over some of the other ones though. So we got. Let's go back up to inflation. So inflation, number 7 on the list. So it made it to the top 10. This is an economic issue. It's a 25% gap between Republicans and Democrats. 52% of Democrats view this as a big issue. 7th highest among issues with 16 issues in surveyed. Likely Republican voters see this as a very big problem at 77%. American adults who see this issue as a very big problem is 65% of those who surveyed. So pretty broad political agreement on this. But it's interesting because I assume that those numbers would flop if Trump was in office or a Republican was in office. I believe that Republicans would probably see inflation as more of, like, not all of them, obviously. Like, it would still be, majority of Republicans seeing this as a big issue, but it would be less than now. And I think the ones that would be less now would be like, well, inflation just means that your economy is doing well, which is partly true, by the way. It is. That doesn't mean it's not an issue. It just means that maybe the economy is doing actually okay, and you need more labor or you need more goods coming to line in order to bring prices down. I mean, one of the easiest ways for inflation to go is for the economy to crash. Nobody wants that. So the other solutions for inflation are to make it to where people can't borrow, which slows the economy, or you bring more goods and services online to meet the demand for those goods and services, which takes time, and then creates more jobs because of those goods and services. And then eventually the price of goods and services go down because there's more competition. This makes sense. It's what the Fed is trying to go for. But I think that this kind of gives us a really good look about where Democrats and Republicans are on general issues, right? And it also shows how much of cultural influences the way people look at. Yeah, it shows how much culture influences the way people look at issues. Because if you look at the top 5, if we look at the top 5, or the top 6 rather, all right, we have moral values. So that's going to be, for Republicans, that means, no degenerates, no weird sex pest creepo weirdos trying to come for the kids. Okay. And for Democrats, that's going to be like, don't be a racist, don't be sexist, don't be xenophobic, don't be transphobic, etc. Right. So they're going to be like, Republicans are going to be like, oh shit. Conservatives are going to be like, oh shit, God is going to put down the wrath on us if we don't suddenly stop being these weirdos. Right. That's how Republican conservatives are going to see this a lot. And hence why it's number 6. Okay. Number 5 is the federal budget deficit. Okay. The federal budget deficit, a lot of like that's more economic, but it matters where money's spent, right? And so if Republicans think the money is being spent well, they're not going to care about the deficit. It's why the tax cuts happened, right? They're like, well, tax cuts pay for them. No, they know that's nonsense. They just don't want taxes to be taken out at all. It's kind of a starve the beast sort of thing, right? So when there's a Republican in office and they cut taxes and the deficit skyrockets, they don't care as much. Same thing with Democrats. Democrats were hemming and hawing about the budget deficits under Trump and how the tax cuts was going to blow up the budget deficit. But the issue wasn't actually the budget deficit. It was the fact that taxes were cut. It was the fact that wealth inequality increased, income inequality increased. It was the fact that people that should be paying more in taxes weren't paying more in taxes. Again, another cultural view of this. Racism, that's purely cultural at this point. I mean, when I say purely cultural, I don't mean that racism doesn't exist. I mean how people view racism is cultural. A lot of conservatives, a lot of Republicans do not view racism as that big of a deal. They view racism itself as a big deal, but they don't view how the US is operating to be necessarily racist. They don't view gaps between black people and white people on various different levels of achievement when it comes to like wealth or income or anything like that to be racially caused, to be caused by racism. They view it as being a failure of culture or, you know, well, that's just the way it is kind of thing. Whereas Democrats see that gap and they're going to be like, well, this is a big issue. We should like close that gap. That gap shouldn't exist. Why does that gap exist? And then they go down the lines and they end up, well, it's partly racism. Okay. Gun violence, another huge cultural one, right? Republicans just want people to have more guns. They think more guns is going to solve this issue. It's not. It actually makes it worse. But that's a way to, culturally speaking. Democrats view it as being just guns. Okay. So if you got rid of the guns, the gun violence would go away. Cultural. Illegal immigration, largely cultural, largely regional. You're starting to see that, okay? You're starting to see that gap close a bit, though. Don't be surprised if some interesting people win election in New York, Boston, or New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, California, some districts in California. Don't be surprised if some of those change because of having to deal more with illegal immigration because of the Republican plan to bus people everywhere. Don't be surprised if that happens. Okay? But this is, again, a largely cultural look because people that believe that they're just coming here in order to get opportunity and save their kids and don't really care that they, quote unquote, broke the law are going to not see that as big of an issue. They're going to see, well, these people will come, they'll get a job, they'll integrate into society, they'll contribute, their kids will have better lives. What do I care? Right? That's how a lot of liberal culturally will see this. Whereas Republicans and conservatives are more likely like, they broke the law, they should get in line, you have to follow the law is right and just, and I don't care if it's not, you still have to follow the law. Order, order, order. Anything that breaks that order, even in a microscopic way, is a bad thing. Right? Like, if they don't respect the laws of this country, why should I expect them to do anything else? Why should they're already a criminal when they got here, sort of thing. They don't have any rights because they're already a criminal. That is a cultural look at how the world is operating. Climate change, the number one issue, is also a cultural look. Because if you believe that climate change is man-made, right? And you believe that because of science, okay, then you're likely to be like, okay, let's work on how to fix that. But if you're culturally driven to be like, man can't change the world, only God can, they're going to look at this as more of a natural occurring cycle, regardless of what the science says. And I'm putting that in quotes because no one actually pays attention to what the science actually says, for the most part. Then you are going to look as a thing that doesn't need to necessarily be fixed by man. This is just the way it is, and we should adjust and cope accordingly. masters of our domain. I give you the, I put you in charge of the earth sort of thing. I don't know the Bible quotes, but in Genesis, So this brings me back to a thing that I repeat regularly. Shout out to Art Black, may he rest in peace, where he pointed this out. He met Andrew Breitbart at an event with his father way long ago. Got to know the man a little bit, okay? And he agreed with Andrew Breitbart on this one point, that politics is downstream from culture. That is, in my opinion, proven by everything that I just went over. Okay? Because how a person's worldview, what that worldview is, rather. All right, let's play that again. Because a person's worldview is going to highly influence how they see problems, what those solutions to those problems will be, and how we can bridge gaps between people that disagree with us and people who agree with us. If you find this to be all a big giant moral failing of man, there's not a bridge to get. There's not a bridge to build there, right? If you see that there is this issue with illegal immigration, and the answer is just to stop the illegal immigration, there's not much of a gap to bridge there when it comes to how to deal with it. And so we have to take these things into account. This isn't to say that it is hopeless to bridge political divides. It's not. But in order to do so, you have to actually understand where the other person's worldview comes from in order to understand what solutions they're going to be okay with and what solutions they're not going to be okay with. It takes a lot of teasing out on this in order to build those bridges. One example, we can talk about border security. Democrats and Republicans aren't going to agree on a border wall, right? They're just not. But they can agree with fines and penalties for repeat violations. Maybe there's some give and take there. Republicans and Democrats might agree with the fact that, hey, maybe a person that's been here for like 15 years and hasn't broken the law other than crossing the border, maybe they shouldn't be kicked out, especially if they have kids. There might be some bridges to build there. Ignore the wall issue. You can find common ground on other things, because the worldview on that is going to overlap maybe a little bit. Climate change. If you're a Democrat, ignore that climate change is man-made. Just don't bring that up, right? Maybe if you want to convince a Republican, you can talk about, well, shouldn't we have clean water? Shouldn't we have healthier air? Then maybe we should cut down on carbon emissions. But if you're going to be like, we need to ban oil, we need to ban coal, you're not going to get anywhere. And for the likewise, if you're a Republican and you want Democrats to be like not fucking punching on oil all the time because we need it in order to function in a modern world, maybe there's a bridge the gap there. If you're like, well, we need oil to produce all this other stuff. Maybe we shouldn't fight the oil industry so much. Maybe we should do other things. So that's where we are right here. Again, politics is downstream from culture / worldview. Culture can be a stand-in for worldview. So that's where we're at. That's why we have these divides. That's why we have these things where people saying that we can't bridge them. Part of that is, again, like we said earlier, is with the way the voting system itself works. That should be changed. I think everybody should agree with that. But we're not going to get there as long as people are talking past each other and not actually hearing what they're saying, what they're actually saying, So if you're wanting to bridge divides, that's my advice. Okay. Find out where they are culturally, find out if there's anything culturally you agree with them on, and try to line it up that way. Because they're not going to care about your solutions if you don't agree with what the actual problem is. Or if you don't at least acknowledge that the problem that they are looking at is a problem. Now, to close this out, the Roundup will keep an eye on how these partisan divides may change in the 428 days until the 2024 election. And we'll keep you updated on these issues that Americans agree are important factors. And with that, my friends, that concludes this segment of the Roundup. Now, if there are things you want to hear on the Roundup, you want to see us cover, you want to know my opinion on, you want to talk to us, you want to be on one of our debate panels, what have you, there are a number of ways you can get a hold of us. First up, you can come over to our Discord. Our Discord is where the easiest place to get a hold of me, where I'm there all the time. Might not be talking much because, again, there's not that many people there right now, but that's the easiest way you can get a hold of me. You can also, if you do Mastodon, you can get a hold of me at cspcypher@federated.press. If you do the Mastodon thing, if you're a good little lefty boy or girl, or they being them, you're good to them, I guess. You can get a hold of me there. You can also, you can still contact me on Twitter at crowdsourced poll. I'm not using it much anymore. I don't like the direction Musk is taking it in. It's basically what it boils down to. Him trying to create an everything app to sell all of my data all of the time is not a thing that I necessarily want, especially with what he's done in regards to how they operate in other countries under his tutelage. Say what you want about Zuckerberg and other places. There's more oversight, I feel like, with Facebook. But I'm not really using Facebook all that much anymore either. I'm more of a Blue Sky user or a Mastodon user now. Speaking of Blue Sky, I will drop my Blue Sky link in the chat here in 1 second. So it is CSP Cypher. I just don't know all the dots in it. Yeah. So it's at CSP Cypher. Whatever, fuck. There it is. So it's at cspcypher.bsky.social. So you can find me there as well. Give me a second. All right, but let's now continue on with the news roundup here, and let us get into the economy and what the outlook of it is. So depending on where you see daily headlines, the economy is either heading for a cliff or entering a recession or coming in for a soft landing. Clickbait headlines are rampant across America's political landscape, including on the economy. Here on the Roundup, we'll continue to find economic reporting that's based on actual numbers. That's because we go behind the headlines where the facts live and clickbait dies. Let's start with a recent article by Michael Foster for Forbes, focused on some factors to show the US economy is actually soaring. Data point number 1. We're going to actually pull that up here while we talk about it. Oh, my camera's not on. Forgot to turn this on. Where is it? Professional. There it is. All right, so this is data point number 1. Let's zoom in so y'all can see this. All right, so that's negative 50 down. That's plus 50%. All right. All right. So most people wouldn't see news about a collapse in China as good for our or the global economy. After all, in a globalized world, what's bad for America's trading partners is generally bad for America. But America isn't really a major trading partner to China anymore. COVID-19 resulted in a long scramble from virtually every company in America to buttress, diversify, and reinforce supply chains to make them less reliant on one region or country. The US, for example, ran out of personal protective equipment in 2020. When some other countries had surpluses, companies won't let that happen again. And as you can see, this is where we are at with 2020. All right, you can see this here. And we had the spike in 2021 of where we were getting China exports. And you can see that it is actually trending down now because of that. Meanwhile, exports from Mexico to the US have surged to 42.6 billion per month, up nearly 70% from before the pandemic. China's export decline shows that worries about the country's economic woes hurting the US haven't come true. And they're not likely to, with Mexico displacing Chinese exports to US, a trend that's likely to continue, along with the trend of companies that are simply moving their operations back to the United States. Here we can see the Mexico exports to the United States. So you can see that it's this is in dollars, and you can see that dip during pretty much every recession, huge dip, and then Mexican exports to the US are growing. Furthermore, consumer spending drives the US economy and the knock-on effect of this spread across the globe. We can now turn over to this graph. So the purple line represents hourly earnings growth in America. That headline number is strong. The orange line represents growth after inflation, which is key to determining whether American consumers are doing better or worse. When it's above zero, they have more purchasing power. That number collapsed in 2022, which was a key reason why stocks tanked. But now that hourly earnings growth is beginning to eclipse cost of living growth. That trend is gone. So we see this purple line. See that purple line here, US hourly earnings year over year, US real average earnings. We see the spike in 2020 where they were pretty much hand in hand. And you can see that the US hourly earnings year over year over into 2023, 2022-ish is continuing. And you can see that how the line, so there's this 22 spike, how this is going down in 2022 to 2023, and it's leveling off, whereas earnings are actually going up. Now, this means that US consumers are starting to earn more than inflation is eating away, with June and July's numbers showing positive impact as well. Now, a few other factors that spell continuing good news for the US economy include used car prices that fell 4.2% year over year in June. That means more used cars entered the market in order to push those prices down. And as more people started to sell off their current cars that they might have bought between 2019, 2018 to 2022, 2023 due to the pandemic, keeping those cars longer than they otherwise would have. There's also this massive glut of used cars that entered the market during the pandemic because rental car companies couldn't sit on inventory that wasn't being rented. It would cost them too much money. So they sold off a massive amount of used cars and replaced those cars over time. But that also pushed down the price of used cars in those years, which made them skyrocket afterwards. In addition to this, though, job openings remain over double their 20-year average, and consumer confidence has surged consistently for months. Turning now to reporting from CNBC News, quote, expectations of a tapped out consumer continue to underline recession fears, but even with rising debt levels, higher interest rates, student loan payment resumption, and inflation, the economic data shows few signs of significant distress. Since last year, the case for a 2023 recession has been Since last year, the case for a 2023 recession has been that consumers would run out of spending power following a post-pandemic spending spree. That narrative has lasted so long that it's now predicated of predictions for a 2024 downturn after no 2023 dip materialized. But even those predictions look shakier after second quarter profits reports have come in. The case for a consumer is also bolstered by a range of other consumer statistics, from deposit levels at big financial institutions like Bank of America to GM car sales. Indeed, the data points to a rebound in a series of economic stats that did make the case that a recession was likely roughly a year ago in the third quarter of 2022. All of the data has improved this year, led by steep decline in inflation, going from a peak that we predicted on this program, that I predicted on this program would happen last year between June and September. And it happened in July, pretty much when I said it was, and we continue to go down now, that we have inflation year over year right now at around 3.3%. This doesn't mean that we have deflation. Prices are still going up, but they're not going up as much, which is a good thing. It's a good thing for consumers. We will continue to see disinflation happen for the next few months. And until a recession happens, we're not going to see deflation. It's just not going to happen. So if you want to see deflation, you either want to see the government massively start to bring goods and services online and just start pumping those out to compete with the private market, or more private businesses suddenly get a ton of cash to come and meet that demand, which will increase inflation in the short term, or you're going to see a recession. And both of those are probably not going to happen. Well, the former, the one with the government spending a bunch of money or private companies suddenly spending a ton of money with the labor shortage that we have, not likely to happen. More likely to see prices actually drop is a recession, and you don't want that. Now, after the Census Bureau reported July retail sales rose 0.7%, both Moody's and the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank raised their real-time tracking forecast for third quarter growth this year. Consumers still have most of the excess savings they built up during COVID, while debt levels and loan delinquencies remain historically low, with wealth measures once again rising. Now, there was a massive increase in savings that happened during the pandemic. A lot of that savings got spent down, okay? But there's still a bigger amount of savings in people's savings accounts and 401ks and IRAs than there were before the pandemic. This can be explained by a number of different things. The student loan pause, all right? Huge for any millennial. If you're a millennial and you had student loans, which most of you did, mine got paid off right before the pandemic, so I didn't have them, but most of them got paused. That's trillions of dollars that actually could circulate in the real economy, not just go into debt servicing. And those trillions of dollars, they went into people's emergency savings, they went into people buying homes, they went into people's 401ks, Roth IRAs, the stock market, etc. That caused savings to go up. A lot of people that lost jobs during the pandemic were either able to get, if they were middle class or above, they typically would have received a severance, and that money went into the bank to buttress against their, to pay for their expenses the few months or whatever it was. But on top of that, unemployment was a little more generous, or a lot more generous, which might have allowed people not to have to tap into that in order to make ends meet. That is what happened to me to a degree. I lost my job in March. Well, I got notified that I was losing my job in March, and I didn't lose it fully until June. So I was still paid for those 2 months and then received a severance. And then after I was laid off fully, I applied for unemployment, applied for GI benefits to go back to school. And between my GI bill, my wife's income, and my unemployment, we only had to tap into my severance very little. This is not that uncommon for people that were middle class or above, or have middle class and above jobs. So we're still sitting on a good amount of savings from that. Not a fuck ton of savings. We're not sitting on like tens of thousands of dollars in savings. We're not rich, okay? But still have pretty good savings from that, which means people in a similar situation to me are also doing that, which gives us more breathing room It makes us a little more willing to spend money instead of like hoarding it all or whatever, right? That is happening across the board. In that vein, consumers are also, though, carrying more debt, but not too much more debt. Again, they have savings, so they're willing to pull on more debt. So at JP Morgan Chase, the biggest US bank, consumer credit card balances per account are lower than in 2019. That is fantastic, Chief Financial Officer Jeremy Brown noted on its recent earnings call. Balances are up a little, but it's not a sign of consumer distress, he said. It's more a wanting than a needing thing, Braun said. We still see it as normalization, not a deterioration story when we talk about consumer credit. In other words, they're expecting consumers to be able to ride this out for the foreseeable future. And consumers are basically saying, well, I want this new couch. I want this new bed. I want this new high purchase item. I'll put it on my credit card and pay it off in a few months instead of like waiting to do that. I mean, and a lot of millennials bought homes. Like, this is another thing. We're going to have to get into that. So just quickly looking here. Yeah, this isn't actually mentioned in later in the copy from what I'm seeing. So 50% of millennials own homes now. Over 50%. Again, I'm going to say that again. Over 50% of millennials now own a home. That number skyrocketed during the pandemic. That's why the housing supply is so constrained. People went out and bought homes all over the place during the exceptional low interest rates that existed at that time. And while housing buying has slowed, it hasn't stopped, which means more people are buying homes now. It's slower, it's more expensive, but people are expecting, like, well, interest rates will go back to 3% eventually. I'll go ahead and buy the home that I need now instead of waiting. So what happens when you buy a home? You buy a bunch of big stuff to furnish it. You do repairs on it. Especially if it's not a brand new home. You go in and you paint your walls and you put in like new beds and you get your kids new stuff to furnish your new home. Massive spending happens for that. Massive spending. And that's what we're seeing out here. Continuing on though, headlines proliferated when U.S. credit balance. Continuing on though. Headlines proliferated when U.S. credit card balances passed $1 trillion for the first time on August 8th, and credit card interest rates have hit near record highs. But consumer loan delinquency rates are at 2019 levels and but consumer loan delinquency rates are at 2019 levels and below any level ever seen before 2014, according to the Federal Reserve data. That means while people are expanding their credit usage and expanding their debt, most people are making their payments. The majority of people are making their payments on time. They're not delinquent. David Fieldhouse, Moody Analytics Director of Predictive Credit Analytics, says consumer debt growth is slowing down. Federal Reserve data are slightly less rosy, but broadly consistent with this. The 5.7% of household income needed to service debt is virtually identical to 2016 to 2019 levels. In other words, we're still in a pretty good state. One reason most homeowners are now moving, One reason for this, though, is that most homeowners are not moving, choosing to keep their 3% mortgages from 2021 or earlier so their payments stay low. Inflation has pushed down real incomes, but the gap is narrowing. This is the heart of consumer-led slowdown argument, and it was true for much of 2022 as inflation peaked at more than 9%. But with inflation back down to about 3% annualized rate and wages raising faster than that, the gap is narrowing, Moody's Scott Hoyt had said. As of June, real incomes are at 2.2% higher than a year earlier, based on government reports. This means that even including inflation, you are likely making 2% more money than you were a year ago. So even including inflation, you are making more than inflation. Now, the drop in real incomes was sharpest earlier last year, when year-over-year compensation were also skewed by the loss of the 2021 stimulus money designed to offset COVID-related business shutdowns. Now, where does the Fed stand in all this? Well, Federal Chairman Jerome Powell focused on the near-term outlook last week when he spoke at the Kansas City Fed's annual symposium, according to reporting from Barron's. The upshot of his talk was mostly a reiteration of what we already know. The Fed would be proceeding cautiously, but the economy might not be cooling as much as we previously thought. Powell didn't commit to any particular way forward, leaving the door open to additional interest rate increases while declining to say what would be coming or when. His closing line, that the central bank would keep at it until the job is done, was lifted almost verbatim from the speech he delivered in the same setting a year ago. As a result, this year's 15-minute speech, quote, was extraordinarily vague on the policy outlook and raised more questions than it provided answers, wrote Stephen Stanley, U.S. chief economist with Santander. Continuing on, he stated, quote, I believe this accurately encapsulates the Federal Open Market Committee's current thinking. And according to Yahoo Finance, the U.S. labor market continues to live its Goldilocks story, with healthy job growth but at a far cooler pace than the blockbuster job gains of the past 2.5 years. On Friday, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the U.S. economy added 187,000 jobs in August, a total that roughly in line with the monthly average seen from 2010 to 2019. In other words, we're still growing, albeit a little more slowly. That figure is considerably below the white-hot job gains that marked the pandemic's recovery, which makes total sense. You had a bunch of people not working, and then suddenly everything opens back up, so everybody returns to work. This was going to be a thing. This was like, even with absent government shutdowns, okay? A lot of businesses were not open. People were not going out to eat at restaurants. They weren't going to movies, etc. And then once people, were comfortable enough to go out and actually experience life again because they weren't afraid of a virus that was killing people off in droves and making people sick, absent that, people went out and started doing more stuff, which means the people had to hire. It's just that simple. Now, the monthly job total came in similar to last month's job gains. However, the July total was revised down by 30,000 jobs to 157,000. Still a good number of jobs created. June was revised down significantly as well, from 185,000 jobs to 105 jobs. The downward revision brought the 3-month average to 150,000 jobs per month, which is pretty good. The unemployment rate unexpectedly jumped a little bit from 3.8% to 3.8%, from 3.5%. So a little bit of an increase in joblessness, but not a ton. Okay, so we're still good for now, but that could always change. It's calmly drifted between 3.4% and 3.7% since March of 2022, and economists had projected it would hold steady at 3.5%. The labor force participation rate rose to 62.8%, the highest it's been since the onset of the pandemic. Remember, this includes people that retired early, full-time students, stay-at-home moms. Like this number includes all those people that would be otherwise working but is not. So, little give and take there. An average hourly earnings grew at a slower monthly pace, ticking up only 0.2%, showing annual growth of 4.3%. In July, wages grew 0.4% and 4.4% respectively. So that's probably just noise in the data. But Forbes reminds us that the increases in unemployment was a healthy increase in the labor force rather than a decline in actual employment, because labor force participation goes up, which means more people entered the workforce, more people looking for jobs, raises the unemployment rate. This development will give rise to hopes that the wage growth can moderate due to the added supply of labor rather than a reduction to demand for workers, which accompanies an economic slowdown. In other words, the likelihood of a Federal Reserve soft landing is on pace. Wage growth moderated to 4.3% year over year and increased at a below expected rate of 0.2% month over month. Those wishing to make the case that for a possible pickup in hiring soon would point to the increase in average weekly hours. The Atlanta Fed currently estimates 3/4 GDP growth at a whopping 5.6%. While actual GDP should come in below that level, even cutting that number in half keeps the economy in above trend growth, and GDP growth is typically accompanied by hiring. So what does this all mean for you and me? Well, if the Fed decides to get a hair up its ass So what does this mean for you and me? Well, if the Fed decides to get go crazy and decides to raise rates a lot more, then we could see the Fed actually push us into a recession through rate increases that would greatly slow down job growth and the ability for companies to hire. That doesn't look like that's what they're going to do. All analysts pretty much expect the Fed to remain paused on its rate increase this coming month and not actually raise rates in September. And if they do that, good on the Fed. That's what the Fed should do. I said the Fed should have paused about maybe 2 rate increases ago, but they're still within that wiggle room of between 5.25% interest rates and 6. There's a little bit of wiggle room in there that can do it to about 5.5%, 5.75% or so. And maybe we'll be okay. We might not see a recession happen from that. It might not cause growth to slow down enough to cause us to have a recession. But my preferred thing for them to do is to remain paused until we hit until next year, Q2 of next year, actually, before adjusting anything. Don't raise rates. Don't lower rates. Keep rates where they are. Let the rates percolate through the economy. Because if they don't do that, and they go because the federal rate increases lag. The impact on the economy is estimated to be as high as a 14-month gap between a rate increase and its effect on the economy, because there's still cheaper money out there, and there's still stocks, and there's still things, and people are adjusting and everything like that. So if they keep it paused, it's going to allow that to permeate through the economy, allow that to percolate, and we could see the actual impacts of what the Fed did to continue on for a few more months. So there's no need, in my opinion, to raise rates. There's no need to even try to get rates at 2%. I think they should be at between 3 and 4%, because that helps workers more. It does. It helps workers more. It makes the economy a little more on fire. It makes not on fire. That's a bad analogy. It makes the economy a little more dynamic. It makes the need for workers a little higher, which gives workers the ability to negotiate for more wage increases and the like. And so if they set their rate target to between 3 and 4%, I think that'd be a lot better than the low 2% that it's set to. But they're not going to change course on that, because the Fed needs what's the right word for this? Legitimacy. So they're not going to do that. They're not going to readjust its target in the middle of raising rates, because then that looks like it admits defeat, which can signal the wrong thing to the economy in general. So they're going to shoot for 2%, but they're going to be like, if they do what I think they're going to do, which is keep rates paused, then they're like, we are remaining rates paused because we are seeing a positive outcome from our previous rate increases, and we do not see a need to raise rates at this time because rates have brought inflation down to X, Y, and Z. But that does not remove our need to potentially raise rates again in the future. Blah blah blah. If they do that, good smooth sailing through 2024. To be honest, I don't see a recession happening if they keep rates steady. I don't expect them to see a recession. And the reason I say I don't expect to see a recession is because of all the consumer confidence, all the millennials buying homes, all the good jobs that are being created, all the union activity that's going on. It's actually working, giving unions and workers better compensation. All this stuff is good for us. And so that's why I don't expect to see a recession yet. Could be pushed out, but not until 2024. And if it happens in 2024, might happen right before the election, which sucks for Democrats. But if they stay steady and everything maintains the way that it is right now, then we'll have avoided another recession. And I say another one because a small one did happen in 2022. Wasn't anything to really be concerned with. And then, of course, it happened in 2020 with COVID. And COVID just reset everything, right? Like recessions, major recessions have been once every major, like not financial crisis major, but have been major and not deep and long lasting, but pretty big. Every 8 years or so. The 2008 one, we took so long to get out of it. It wasn't really until 2014 where most people started to see a benefit from that recession, even though the recession officially ended in 2010, 2009, 2010 or so. That was so deep and long lasting in impact on the economy with debt and everything else, that because it didn't come out until 2014 or so, we weren't scheduled for another recession for too much growth too quickly or too much debt, whatever, until 2022. But COVID happened. So maybe we won't get another one until 2028. Just my thoughts. But as more news comes out about this, we'll be sure to let you know on the News Roundup. So stay tuned for that. But that concludes this segment of the News Roundup. All right, we're all about done. Oh, man, my nose itches. All right, we're about done, so we're going to go ahead and plow through these news bites here. So what we got for you, some interesting news coming out of the real estate industry. So Axios has reported that women in the real estate industry have grappled recently with the dangers they face from potential clients. But some also reportedly face misconduct from one of their own, the head of their powerful trade group. Kenny Parcel, president of the National Association of Realtors, NAR, resigned last week after a New York Times report detailed sexual harassment allegations against him. The report included alleged instances of inappropriate touching and Parcel sending lewd photos. You think in 2023 this would just stop? No, don't send nudes to colleagues unless they ask, and even then, be very wary of why they're asking. Fuck, stop trying to shit where you trying to eat where you shit. Fuck. Now, current and former NAR employees also described a culture of fear, harassment, and retaliation within the organization. The NAR has 1.5 million members, making it the largest trade organization in the country. It's a giant in the real estate industry, controlling access to nearly all home listings in the US, the Times has said. About 66% of their group members are women, and women make up the majority of the real estate agents nationwide. Yet the structure of the industry leaves women unprotected from potential abuse and violence. Maybe the NAR should not exist, because this 1.5 million members, that's huge, one, but it controls nearly all access to all home listings in the US. Come on. You can't give an organization that much power. Even absent the sexual harassment, sexual assault allegations here, right? This is just too much power. And if this guy, the president, has this much power, it gives them power to abuse the system, because it was like, well, if you want the listings, better do what I say. I'm not saying that's what he did, but I'm just saying that opens the possibility for it, and that shouldn't happen. But let's continue on. Parcel has denied all allegations against him, calling them categorically false. President-elect Tracy Casper, who is meant to succeed Parcel in November, will instead start immediately, the NAR said. Quote, "I'm incredibly sorry for what's led us here," Casper said in a statement. Continuing on, he stated, quote, "We recognize that this is a loss that..." Continuing on, he stated, quote, "We recognize there is a lots of concern, anger, and disappointment," she said, adding, fuck. All right, I'm just going to restart that. President-elect Tracy Casper, who was meant to succeed Parcel in November, will instead start immediately, the NAR said. She stated, quote, "I'm incredibly sorry for what's led us here. We recognize there is lots of concern, anger, and disappointment. We have taken everything we have heard to heart." End quote. And in additional news for our little news segment, we're going to talk about SAG-AFTRA. A lot is still up in the air when it comes to ongoing negotiations of SAG-AFTRA strike. But according to Nerdist, there's a little more clarity in terms of the AMC network's future. 3 shows, The Walking Dead, Daryl Dixon, The Walking Dead, The Ones Who Live, and Interview with the Vampire will resume production after AMC Networks struck agreements with SAG-AFTRA. According to Deadline, production and filming will resume on these 3 shows. Keep in mind, this agreement is only for those shows, and not an overall agreement between AMC Networks and SAG-AFTRA. And it's an interim deal, so things could possibly change in the future. Whether this spells potential similar deals with other studios as strike drags on remains to be seen. One thing is clear though, the fall television season and streaming industries will leave viewers with little new content. A side effect of the strike may well be that more Americans will pay attention to what's happening politically. We saw this kind of socio-political shift happen after the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police in 2020. As the pandemic raged, millions took to the streets in protest. Attention to the issues of black people dying at the hands of police was bolstered by the fact that television and movie studios were also shut down. The resulting focus on political and civil rights engagement led to some substantive changes in law enforcement and legislation, though to be sure, not enough for many people. It was still too little, too late. Now, the SAG-AFTRA strike may lead to new political engagement by Americans who don't typically pay much attention to the minutia. If that happens, it's likely to leave an impact on the 2024 election. Keep the people entertained and fed, and they won't bitch much. Entertainment and feeds stop happening, the people will revolt. There's a Roman quote in there somewhere, I think. But of course, we will keep you updated on those stories as they develop here on the News Roundup. Now, if you do not know, we like to close up our News of the Roundup with some news of the weird. And this week, is no different. Over the past few months, we've been brought you videos of some high-tech conferences that include robots, but this Associated report from China 2 weeks ago shows how the tech is advancing and becoming downright creepy. We're not going to have audio playing because of the fact that it's in Chinese. But actually, and the fact that it's playing music in the background, which we do not want to have taking down our stream. So let's go ahead and get to it. Well, I'll put up some other music in the background here. Yeah, we'll just put some other music in the background. A little low music in the background. Okay, that's creepy. But why do they make them look like the Borg? Oh, you can't see it because of my face. Hold on. Yeah. Nope. Let me over here. You can see the words. All right, we're just going to start this over. Bro, they look like the Borg. They look like the Borg, man. That's so creepy. Oh, that's cool. Facial recognition. Yeah, see, okay. So to explain this a little bit. So all these little triangles that you see on this man's face that's projected on it, those are to like track facial expressions and eye movement and etc. And so because he's able to express and stuff, and it's going to pull all those triangles around, it actually makes the robot do the same thing. That's weird, dude. Wow. Giving working from home a whole new meaning. Oh, man. Wow. That's nuts. All right, I think that's good enough for this. But isn't that kind of interesting though? Like, isn't that interesting though that we have robots doing these lifelike expressions? But everybody, with that, I am sad to say we are out of time. We know you liked what you heard because you stayed with us to the end. So please, 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 please smash that like button for the algorithms. It really does help us out. We like to give special thanks to our Facebook community and Discord community who provide us with many of our stories that we're able to pontificate on. And it gives us a good look about where people are paying attention to when it comes to the news for our community. So if you want to see us share something, again, post it up on our Discord, ask us to talk about a thing. We'll give you our opinions on it and we'll give it to the world. Special thanks again to our copy producer, Nikki Adams, who writes much of the copy, if not all of it, depending on the day. Today, she wrote all of it. But without her, this would not be as of a robust news program because honestly, I simply don't have the real life time to dedicate to doing 2 hours of news every week. So thank you, Nikki, again for the copy. We're doing other projects here. We're doing a podcast, obviously, is what this is, the News Roundup. Also doing more debates. Did one last week. Going to be at MDDCon 4 in Dallas on November 4th and 5th. So we've got a lot of stuff coming up. So if you want to pay attention, get our calendar. Think above or below, depending on where you're looking at it, and look for updates therein. And as we say at Crowdsource Politics, keep your head up, your political storm.